There are resources that nations take for granted until the moment they realize those resources can be withdrawn. Oil can be replaced with alternatives. Minerals can be sourced from multiple suppliers. Technology can be developed domestically given sufficient time and investment. But water, the fundamental requirement for human survival, agricultural production, and industrial civilization, cannot be substituted. And water, unlike oil or minerals, does not flow according to market prices or diplomatic agreements. Water flows according to geography. Canada controls that geography. And in late 2025, Canadian policymakers began a quiet campaign to ensure that the United States understands exactly what that control means. This is not about drought conditions that will improve when weather patterns shift. This is about permanent hydrological changes driven by climate dynamics that are making the American Southwest uninhabitable, while simultaneously increasing the value of Canadian water resources to levels that make them strategic assets, rather than natural resources. Most Americans believe that water scarcity is a problem for other countries, distant places, with poor infrastructure and inadequate planning. The assumption is that the United States, with its advanced economy and technological capabilities, will always find engineering solutions to water challenges. That assumption is colliding with mathematical realities that engineering cannot overcome. The Colorado River, which supplies water to 40 million people across 7 states, is operating at approximately 31% of its historical flow levels. Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the massive reservoirs that regulate that flow, are at 28% capacity. The aquifers beneath the Great Plains that have sustained American agriculture for generations are being depleted at rates that exceed natural recharge by factors of 40 to 1 in some regions. These are not temporary conditions that will reverse when rainfall patterns improve. These are structural changes in North American hydrology driven by temperature increases, precipitation pattern shifts, and snowpack reductions that climate models predict will intensify regardless of mitigation efforts. By 2040, according to assessments from the U.S. Geological Survey and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, water availability in states from California to Texas will have declined by between 35% and 60% compared to late 20th century baselines. Agricultural production in regions that currently supply significant portions of American food will become economically unviable. Cities that were built in desert environments under the assumption that water could always be imported from distant sources will face existential decisions about managed population decline. Meanwhile, Canada is experiencing the opposite hydrological trend. Warming temperatures are increasing precipitation across much of Canadian territory. Glacial melt in the Rockies is expanding river flows in British Columbia and Alberta. The vast boreal forest regions of Ontario and Quebec are seeing increased water table levels that are creating new wetland systems and expanding existing watersheds. Canada controls approximately 20% of the world's freshwater resources. But that percentage understates the strategic significance because it does not account for accessibility, quality, or proximity to demand centers. The Great Lakes system, which contains approximately 21% of the world's surface fresh water, is shared between Canada and the United States under agreements that were negotiated in an era when both countries assumed water would always be abundant. Those agreements are now being re-examined by Canadian provincial governments that recognize the increasing value of water resources in a world where scarcity is becoming the dominant condition. Ontario alone controls access to 4 of the 5 Great Lakes through geography that gives Canadian provinces the ability to regulate flow rates, diversion projects, and consumption levels in ways that could fundamentally alter water availability for American states and cities that depend on Great Lakes water. The city of Chicago draws approximately 2.1 billion gallons of water per day from Lake Michigan. Milwaukee, Detroit, Cleveland, and Buffalo are similarly dependent on Great Lakes water for municipal supply, industrial cooling, and power generation. The entire American manufacturing belt, which has historically been located in the Great Lakes region precisely because of water availability, is built on the assumption that this water will remain accessible. In November 2025, the Ontario provincial government announced the formation of the Great Lakes Water Security Commission, a regulatory body tasked with conducting comprehensive assessments of water usage, ecosystem impacts, and long-term sustainability of current withdrawal rates from the Great Lakes system. The announcement was framed as an environmental initiative focused on protecting aquatic ecosystems and ensuring intergenerational water security for Ontario residents. But the strategic implications were immediately apparent to American policymakers who understood that regulatory reviews could lead to restrictions on water diversions that would affect American cities and industries. The timing was deliberate. The Great Lakes Water Security Commission was established during the same period when trade disputes between Canada and the United States were reaching their peak intensity. The message was clear without being explicitly stated. Water access, like energy access, was subject to Canadian regulatory decisions that would prioritize Canadian interests. American officials who contacted their Ontario counterparts seeking reassurance about continued water access received carefully worded responses that emphasized the Commission's mandate to ensure sustainable water use and protect ecosystem integrity. There were no guarantees. There were no commitments to maintain current withdrawal rates indefinitely. There was only the acknowledgement that water policy would be guided by scientific assessments and Ontario's legal obligations to its own residents. The absence of guarantees was itself a strategic communication. For decades, American states had operated under the assumption that access to Great Lakes water was a settled matter, governed by international agreements that could not be easily modified. Ontario was serving notice that those assumptions were no longer valid. But the Great Lakes represented only one dimension of Canadian water leverage. The northern river systems that flow through Canadian territory toward Hudson Bay and the Arctic Ocean represented a second and potentially more significant source of strategic water resources. The Churchill River system in northern Manitoba discharges approximately 35 billion cubic meters of fresh water annually into Hudson Bay. The Nelson River, which flows through hydroelectric installations that generate power for export to American markets, adds another 108 billion cubic meters. Combined, these river systems move more water annually than the entire Colorado River system at its historical peak flow levels. For decades, this water has been considered economically worthless because it flows into Hudson Bay rather than toward population centers where it could be used for agriculture, industry, or municipal supply. The engineering challenges and costs of diverting this water southward were considered prohibitive given abundant water availability in more accessible locations. Climate change and hydrological deterioration in the American Southwest have completely altered that economic calculation. In March 2025, a consortium of Canadian engineering firms, water technology companies, and provincial development corporations released a feasibility study examining the technical and economic viability of large-scale water diversion from northern Canadian river systems toward American markets experiencing chronic water scarcity. The study, which was funded by the Manitoba provincial government with support from federal infrastructure programs, outlined a phased approach to developing what it termed the North American Water Security Corridor. The proposed system would involve a network of pipelines, canals, and pumping stations that could move up to 15 billion cubic meters of water annually from northern Manitoba southward toward the Great Plains and ultimately toward southwestern states facing water emergencies. The technical specifications were detailed and credible. The cost estimates, while staggering at approximately $340 billion for full system development, were within the range of other continental-scale infrastructure projects. The timeline projected initial operational capacity within 8 years, with full system completion possible within 15 to 18 years. But the most significant aspect of the study was not the engineering proposal. It was the economic framework that accompanied it. The study proposed that water transported through the North American Water Security Corridor would be priced at rates reflecting its value as a scarce strategic resource rather than as a bulk commodity. The suggested pricing structure would charge American water utilities and agricultural districts approximately $4.80 per cubic meter for delivered water. To understand the implications of that price, consider that current water costs for American agricultural users in the Southwest range from 0.02 to 0.08 per cubic meter, depending on location and source. The proposed Canadian water would cost 60 to 240 times current rates. At those prices, the annual revenue from a fully operational water export system could exceed $72 billion, making water Canada's most valuable export commodity, surpassing energy, minerals, and agricultural products combined. American reactions to the feasibility study revealed the desperation that water scarcity was creating in affected regions. Rather than dismissing the proposal as economically absurd due to pricing, officials from states including Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico began immediate discussions with Canadian counterparts about the possibility of securing access to Canadian water supplies. The fact that American officials were willing to even consider prices that were orders of magnitude higher than current water costs demonstrated how severe the water crisis had become and how limited the alternatives were. Desalination, often proposed as the technological solution to water scarcity, remains prohibitively expensive for large-scale agricultural and industrial use. Current desalination costs range from $0.50 to $2 per cubic meter, and those costs apply only to coastal locations where seawater is readily available. Moving desalinated water inland to agricultural regions requires additional infrastructure and energy that drives costs even higher. Canadian water, despite pricing that seemed exorbitant by historical standards, was actually competitive with desalination alternatives while offering the advantage of being fresh water that required no treatment and could be delivered directly to inland agricultural regions through pipeline infrastructure. The economic leverage that Canadian water pricing created was matched by regulatory leverage that provincial governments were carefully constructing through environmental and resource management frameworks. In June 2025, British Columbia implemented the Water Sustainability Act, which established provincial authority to regulate all water exports from BC territory and to require environmental impact assessments for any water diversion projects that could affect ecosystems, Indigenous communities, or long-term water security within the province. The Act created a regulatory framework where water export licenses would be granted only after extensive review processes that could take years to complete and would be subject to conditions that prioritized British Columbia's interests. Those conditions could include requirements for revenue sharing with Indigenous communities, mandatory environmental remediation funding, and guarantees of continued water availability for domestic use, regardless of export commitments. Similar regulatory frameworks were being developed in Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba. The collective effect was to create a system where Canadian water access for American users would be subject to multiple layers of provincial and federal regulation that could be modified or revoked based on changing priorities or diplomatic considerations. American policymakers who had spent decades negotiating trade agreements focused on goods, services, and investment found themselves confronting a resource domain where their leverage was essentially non-existent. You cannot compel a neighboring country to export water. You cannot develop alternative suppliers when geography determines where water exists, and you cannot build domestic alternatives when your territory is becoming hydrologically unsustainable. The strategic implications extended beyond municipal water supply and agricultural irrigation to encompass industrial production and energy generation. Modern industrial facilities require enormous water volumes for cooling, processing, and waste management. Data centers, semiconductor fabrication plants, and advanced manufacturing facilities are particularly water intensive. As water scarcity intensified in the American Southwest and parts of the Great Plains, companies began evaluating whether to invest billions in retrofitting existing facilities to operate with reduced water availability or to relocate operations to regions where water was more abundant and reliable. Canada was actively positioning itself as the destination for that industrial relocation. Provincial governments were offering tax incentives, infrastructure support, and guaranteed water allocations to companies willing to establish operations in Canadian locations. The job losses in American states were not hypothetical projections for distant futures. They were occurring in real time as companies made strategic decisions about where to build their next generation of facilities. In August 2025, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company announced that its planned expansion in Arizona would be scaled back significantly due to concerns about long-term water availability. The company simultaneously announced increased investment in a new fabrication facility in Alberta, where provincial water allocations and hydroelectric power availability provided the resources necessary for advanced semiconductor manufacturing. The symbolism was significant. TSMC, the world's most advanced semiconductor manufacturer, was explicitly choosing Canadian locations over American ones based on resource availability. Other technology companies took notice. By December 2025, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon had all announced major data center expansions in Canadian provinces, while simultaneously delaying or canceling planned expansions in southwestern American states. The stated reason in each case was identical: water availability and long-term resource security. These corporate decisions represented a transfer of economic activity, tax revenue, and employment from the United States to Canada that was driven entirely by hydrological realities that policy could not change. American political responses revealed the limited options available to address water-driven economic migration. Federal officials could not override the physical reality that certain regions were running out of water. State governments could not compel companies to locate facilities in areas where resource constraints threatened operational viability. And no amount of diplomatic pressure could force Canada to export water on terms favorable to American interests when Canadian provinces had alternative uses for those resources. The agricultural implications were creating even more immediate political pressures. The Central Valley of California, which produces approximately 25% of American food by value, was facing terminal water scarcity that threatened production levels within 5 to 7 years, according to state agricultural assessments. Farmers who had invested generations in developing agricultural operations were confronting decisions about whether to abandon farmland that had been productive for over a century. The economic losses from agricultural collapse in California alone were projected to exceed $180 billion, with cascading impacts on food processing, transportation, and related industries. Canadian agricultural provinces, meanwhile, were experiencing the opposite dynamic. Saskatchewan and Alberta were seeing expansion of arable land as northern regions became warm enough and wet enough to support crop production that had previously been impossible. The irony was profound. Climate change that was destroying agricultural viability in the American Southwest was simultaneously creating new agricultural opportunities in Canadian provinces that had historically been constrained by short growing seasons and limited precipitation. By 2030, according to agricultural projections from both Canadian and American research institutions, Canada would be producing more wheat, canola, and other staple crops than the United States for the first time in history. The shift represented a permanent change in agricultural geography, driven by hydrological conditions that policy interventions could not reverse. The strategic implications of Canadian water control extended beyond bilateral relations to encompass broader questions about North American security and stability. Water scarcity has historically been one of the primary drivers of population migration, political instability, and regional conflict. If southwestern American states became uninhabitable due to water scarcity, where would those populations relocate? How would receiving states manage sudden population increases that strained their own infrastructure and resources? What would happen to property values, municipal tax bases, and regional economies in areas that were depopulating due to environmental conditions? These were not theoretical questions for distant planning horizons. These were immediate concerns that state governments were beginning to address through emergency planning processes that had previously been reserved for natural disasters or security threats. Canada was watching these dynamics with careful attention to the implications for its own security and immigration systems. Provincial officials were developing frameworks for managing potential migration pressures from American populations, fleeing water scarcity, while simultaneously ensuring that Canadian water resources were managed sustainably for long-term domestic needs. The fundamental question facing policymakers on both sides of the border was whether water would be treated as a strategic resource subject to national control or as a shared continental resource that should be managed cooperatively regardless of political boundaries. Canadian positions on that question were becoming increasingly clear through regulatory frameworks, pricing studies, and infrastructure proposals that all pointed toward treating water as a strategic asset that would be made available to international customers only on terms that maximized Canadian economic benefits and maintained Canadian control over allocation decisions. American positions were less coherent because they were constrained by political realities that made it difficult to acknowledge the severity of water dependence on Canadian cooperation. Admitting that American economic viability in multiple states depended on water imports from Canada would undermine narratives about American self-sufficiency and energy independence that remained politically important regardless of their accuracy. This political constraint meant that American responses to Canadian water strategy were reactive and fragmented rather than coordinated and strategic. Individual states negotiated separately with Canadian provinces. Federal agencies conducted studies and issued reports. But there was no unified American position on how to address the fundamental reality that geography had given Canada control over resources that the United States could not replace or do without.